Peasant Revolution in Ethiopia. The Tigray People's Liberation Front, 1975 to 1991, by Dr. John Young, Chapter 2, Part 3. Haile Selassie did, however, make some concessions to Tigrayan sensitivities, notably in his more overt attempts to have Amhara officialdom administer Tigray. The land tax, which caused so much resentment, was eliminated, and in its place a tribute system was introduced in which Tigrayan themselves decided who paid and how much they paid as long as they met the overall demands of the central government. A measure of provincial autonomy was thus retained, but the trend towards state centralization continued. The TPLF and some academics contend that the revolt represented the collective response of an oppressed nation to Shoan Amhara oppression. However, both the principal historian of the Woyene, Gibru Tareke, and the foremost historian of Tigray from the period of Yohannes to the overthrow of the imperial regime in 1974, Haggai Ehrlich, contend that the revolt was not fundamentally an expression of Tigrayan nationalism. According to Gebru, quote, the peasants rebelled against the state not particularly because it was controlled and dominated by the Shoan Amhara, but primarily because it was oppressive. He further points out that the Raya and Azibo repeatedly rose up against the state regardless of whether the Tigrayan Emperor Yohannes or the Shoan Amhara Emperors Menelik and Haile Selassie were in control. Ehrlich in turn acknowledges the importance of Tigrayanism as a rallying cry in the revolt, but argues that it was a slogan rather than a program, and that Tigrayan self-awareness was inseparable from Ethiopianism. The Tigrayan peasant sense of national identity and anti-Amhara sentiments were recorded by 18th century foreign visitors, but until the TPLF-led insurrection, the peasants' devotion to maintaining their autonomy in the face of state attempts at incorporation and demands on their produce has been more important than any desire to fight for nationalist goals, and this appears to be the case with respect to the Woyene. Demands were of a local character. Few peasants outside of eastern Tigray participated in the struggle, and the calculated involvement of a small minority of Tigrayan nobles suggests that they were more concerned with individual rather than national interests. Ethnonationalism is a product of modernization which breaks down primordial loyalties and links otherwise geographically isolated peoples. This process was set in motion by the Italian occupation, but was only weakly felt at the time of the Woyene. On the one hand, peasants were still deeply divided, and on the other, the Tigrayan nobility did not have the incentive to lead a revolt which might ultimately undermine their own fading powers. The problem of characterizing the Woyene cannot be satisfactorily resolved here, and the small number of interviews of Raya and Azibo Woyene veterans that were carried out in the course of this research are not a sufficient basis for drawing convincing conclusions. These interviews would not, however, support the contention that peasant participants in the revolt were solely or even overwhelmingly motivated by nationalist considerations. Too many currents can be identified in the Woyene, such as incomplete national integration, national oppression, uneven economic development, peasant deprivation, and intra-feudal struggles to convincingly single out one of them as being dominant. The Woyene can probably be best classified as quote-unquote primary resistance, or traditional military challenges that start in the hinterland and are or may be precursors of later and more developed organizational protests that are based in urban centers and follow the norms of Western political movements. It is thus in this sense that the Woyene can be considered as the heir to the TPLF struggle of 30 years later. Nonetheless, the TPLF's interpretation of the Woyene, the use to which the movement put this inheritance of anti-state struggle, and the tactical lessons drawn from it are important in their own right. It is thus noteworthy that one of the early names of the TPLF was to be called Hizbawi Woyene Harnet Tigray, in English, People's Revolution for the Liberation of Tigray, which was designed to link the movement's struggle with that of 1943. The Woyene was an expression of resistance to the growing role of the state in people's lives, but its failure to engage the mass of Tigrayans in the revolt indicated the insular character of the society in the 1940s. Already, however, this insularity was breaking down before the combined assault of the central state devoted to eliminating the authority of regional powers and the autonomy of peasant minorities such as the Raya and the Wijarat on the one hand, and the expansion of communications and trade on the other. State centralization and modernization over the following 20 years further reduced the powers of the regional nobility, broke down some of the divisions between the peasantry, and, crucially, gave birth to a petite bourgeoisie. The central state's efforts to replace personal means of control with bureaucratic institutions spurred dissension because it gave the petite bourgeoisie functionaries of those institutions a critical role in the development and security of the state, but at the same time it denied them a share in power. Defeat of the Italians left the British in a commanding position in the Horn of Africa, but they were increasingly stretched financially and militarily, opposed by the United States, and as a result were unable to take on the role of master of the region. In the rapidly changing international configurations, the United States became Haile Selassie's new patron, and one far less demanding than the British, since their interest was the global containment of the Soviet Union, and this was seen as being best pursued by fostering close relations with trustworthy local allies. Haile Selassie's regime was considered to be such an ally, and in return for his support of their anti-communist agenda and the establishment of an important communications base at Kagnu outside Asmara, the United States provided crucial support for his objectives of acquiring possession of Eritrea and modernizing the army. As a result, until his overthrow in 1974, the emperor ruled in conditions of quote-unquote untrammeled autocracy. Throughout this period, Haile Selassie worked to reduce or eliminate regional bases of power by taking greater control over appointments, ensuring that tax payments went to the Ministry of Finance instead of to the nobility, monetizing the collection of taxes and tithes, creating and maintaining a central armed force and police, and developing a system of state-supported education. Political reform, however, did not parallel administrative reform. In 1955, the emperor did revise the 1931 constitution, but this was largely an exercise in public relations and far from granting rights to citizens. It confirmed their status as subjects before the all-powerful monarch. Nor did his reforms allow much scope for the integration of nationalities beyond the selective incorporation of ethnic elites through Amharization, marriage, and patronage, policies that predated Menelik. To the extent these measures were effective, they reformed the administrative links between center and periphery and increased the power of the emperor. However, they did not fundamentally alter the character of Shoan Amhara domination, and nor ultimately did they strengthen the regime. Moreover, as Clapman has noted, Haile Selassie's efforts at state centralization seriously undermined the autonomy of the nobility, and this in turn served to weaken the connection between the central government and political authority in the countryside. The move to reliance on bureaucratic and personal forms of administration also served to produce and give increasing importance to the petite bourgeoisie, the class that was to prove the emperor's undoing. This changing class configuration is illustrated by the attempted coup of the emperor's palace guard in 1960, even though it was led by two members of the Shoan aristocracy, General Mengistu Niwai and his American-educated brother Garmame. The plotters demanded political reforms, although not the abolition of the monarchy, which they proposed to give a constitutional status. The coup attempt was too brief and disorganized to mobilize national support, but following a personal appeal by Mengistu, virtually all the students at the university marched through the capital in sympathy. Although the coup was defeated, it began the process of undermining the imperial mystique and also served to bring students into the political arena. Opposition to the regime was not restricted to the elite and urban population in the post-war period. Ethnic and rural dissatisfaction also came to the fore. Mention has been made of the Woyene. In addition, in the southeastern province of Bale, the introduction of Christian settlers from the north, among largely Muslim Somali peasants and nomads, fostered rebellion in the latter half of the 1960s. Higher taxes and reclassification of land triggered a revolt in the northern province of Gojam in 1968, but peasants were also unhappy at being administered by Shoan governors. The most significant rebellion, however, was in Eritrea because it increasingly gained the support of non-traditional elements within the territory and served to challenge the legitimacy of the imperial regime. Under European colonialism, Eritrea not only developed a wider industrial base than Ethiopia, but its people were also permitted, at least under the British, a far greater role in the political sphere. There was no place for popular political expression or Eritrean identity under the autocratic regime of Haile Selassie, and in 1961 a rebellion broke out 1 year before the emperor dissolved the federal union and united Eritrea with Ethiopia. Initially, the rebellion was dominated by the Eritrean Liberation Front, ELF, but its dependence on support from Muslims and traditional rulers and its foreign assistance from the Arab Middle East meant that it was ill-adapted to gain the allegiance of the Christian half of the population. In the 1970s, the ELF was eclipsed by the Marxist-Leninist Eritrean People's Liberation Front, EPLF, which quickly gained a wider basis of indigenous support as well as the growing sympathy of Ethiopia's radical intelligentsia. The growing revolt in Eritrea and the spread of urban dissent throughout the empire undermined the regime. So did the continuing decline of the peasant economy. Drought precipitated famine in northern Ethiopia in 1972, but the underlying causes were uneven patterns of economic growth, inappropriate development plans, and a complete lack of concern on the part of the government for the welfare of the country's peasants. Indeed, the famine occurred at a time when the country had food supplies that remained undistributed, causing people to starve to death in the midst of plenty. The famine was symptomatic of the failures of the old regime that were becoming apparent to ever wider sections of the largely urban and increasingly politically conscious population of the country in the 1970s. Moreover, unlike many earlier Ethiopian famines, this one was to have a marked effect on the unfolding politics of the country. Shortages produced rapidly rising grain prices in the towns that had a severe impact on workers, soldiers, and urban poor, and gave rise to comparisons with the French Revolution, which had also been preceded by famine. British television's Jonathan Dimbleby's exposure of a famine that the government was assiduously trying to ignore did much to undermine the international legitimacy of Haile Selassie's regime, and also provided further and graphic evidence that radical elements in the towns used to assail the regime. The overthrow of the old regime. A key component of the developing opposition was the Ethiopian student movement, which Markakis has called the imperial regime's political nemesis. The student movement took form at Haile Selassie First University, HSIU, which after the overthrow of the old regime in 1974 was renamed Addis Ababa University, AAU. As in many other countries, Western education proved a stimulus to question and challenge prevailing institutions. The university experienced its first political stirrings during the 1960 coup attempt. Although its failure punctured the students' self-confidence, and it was not until 1965 that they again entered the political arena with a march on Haile Selassie's parliament demanding land reform. It is from this period that the emergence of what became the strongest student movement in Africa can be dated. By this time, most university students rejected royal blood and religious sanctions as legitimate sources of political authority, viewed the regime as corrupt, and held that a highly inequitable proportion of the nation's resources was going into landed interests. In the absence of political parties or forms of education different from those in other developing countries, early radicalism at the university has been attributed to the presence of politically conscious foreign students in the country, together with declining employment prospects for the educated minority. In the first instance, Ethiopian students who frequently perceived themselves and their country as superior to the visiting scholarship students from quote unquote black colonized Africa were shocked to find that these students typically came from countries with higher standards of living, development, and political organization than Ethiopia. Unfavorable comparisons between conditions in Ethiopia and the rest of Africa were also facilitated by the presence of large numbers of African diplomats in Addis Ababa, which served as the headquarters for both the Organization of African Unity OAU, and for the UN Economic Commission for Africa, ECA. Secondly, declining employment opportunities in the 1960s and 1970s for the educated minority meant that there was less scope for the government to co-opt disaffected intellectuals into the bureaucracy. Because most students came from non-aristocratic backgrounds, it has been argued that their radicalism sprang from a perceived future of landlessness and the obstacles posed by an aristocracy which monopolized investment in commercial land enterprises. The same author holds that students raised their leading slogan of land to the tiller as a means to draw the southern peasantry into a political coalition against the landlords. While these sociological and political factors must figure in any explanation of the direction taken by the Ethiopian student movement, probably more significant were the few opportunities the intelligentsia had in the modern private sector, which was largely foreign-owned and barred many Ethiopians from advancement, or in the state bureaucracy where it occupied a well-paid but subordinate position. As Kiflu Tadesse has noted, quote, "The only escape from this petite bourgeois destiny lay through the exercise of political power, a fact that eventually turned the intelligentsia into a dissident group." End quote. In the first instance, the struggles of the Ethiopian students must be understood in the context of anti-colonial and nationalist movements that took form across the developing world in this period. It would thus be a mistake to deny the importance of youthful idealism and the influence of revolutionary experiences of the past, notably China and Cuba, and the contemporary period, particularly Vietnam, in inspiring students. The commitment and selflessness of large numbers of students who risked their lives during the Derg's Red Terror and through their participation in the various liberation movements cannot be reduced to simple careerism or political opportunism. Moreover, it is probably not coincidental that student demands for land reform were popularized 1 year after the initiation of the government program in 1964 to send university students to the countryside. This brought students into direct contact with people whose lives they wanted to change at a time when conditions generally for the country's peasants were deteriorating. In a country where literacy rates in the 1960s were below 10%, the small number of students who gained entry into Ethiopia's only university constituted a privileged minority. It has been estimated that no more than 8,000 Ethiopians held higher degrees, including university graduates in 1970, and Ottaway reckoned that Ethiopia had one of the smallest educated classes as a percentage of its population of any country in Africa. Only a minority of the students, however, were actually from the ruling nobility, because relatively speaking, this was a small grouping, and further, Their children either had no need to take up higher education or it was pursued in North America and Europe. Indeed, by the late 1960s, there were almost 2,000 students abroad, one-third of them in the United States. By the mid-1960s, Ottaway contends that most university students at HSIU, quote, came from urban families of traders, clerks, policemen, lower-level government employees, in other words, the Ethiopian petite bourgeoisie, end quote. This must be qualified with respect to Tigray. The majority of students at HSIU came from Shoa and Eritrea, the most economically developed provinces of the country with the largest petite bourgeoisies. However, with the exception of poor scholarship students in far less developed Tigray, students were more likely to come from backgrounds in the rich peasantry and lower nobility. In any case, as Balsavik points out, students from privileged families did not appear less opposed to the regime than their colleagues with lower status. Instead, it probably gave them more self-assurance. Tilahun Gizau, a prominent student leader and Tigrayan, for example, was the son of a wealthy landowner and the brother of one of Haile Selassie's daughters-in-law. Oromos, who constituted the largest ethnic community in Ethiopia, comprised less than 10% of the university student population at the end of the 1960s. Although the Muslim population equaled that of Christians in Ethiopia, because of discrimination they experienced and their fears that state education was a means to assimilate them into Christian culture of the dominant Abyssinians, they represented only a small minority at the university. Females were also a negligible force at the university, amounting to only 9% of the student body. While the student movement led the assault on the regime and gave it ideological fervor and political direction, it was only one of a number of largely urban forces that became increasingly disaffected with the old regime in the late 1960s and early 1970s. Workers and the lower middle class protested against declining living standards. Teachers opposed government-proposed reforms that would adversely affect the children of poor parents. Professionals were angered by their exclusion from political power. Eritreans demanded self-determination and their own state. In the face of the refusal of the old regime to allow democratic participation through the formation of political parties, the growing disenchantment was expressed in the streets and took the form of direct opposition to the regime. However, it was the students alone among the organized collectivities in Addis Ababa who consistently engaged in overt anti-system acts. This opposition forced the government to rely increasingly on the army to maintain order. However, the army, and particularly its junior officers from non-aristocratic backgrounds, was not immune to demands for political reform and higher wages. Revolt spread to the army, and a faction within the army that was to be known as the Derg. It was this group of about 120 non-commissioned officers, enlisted soldiers, and radical junior officers with ties to the intelligentsia, which overthrew the imperial regime in February 1974 and formed the de facto government, the Provisional Military Administration Council, PMAC. The overthrow of the old regime was widely applauded in urban Ethiopia, particularly by the students, but they were soon engaged in a struggle for control of the state with the Durg, which was receptive to the students' socialist program because of its popular appeal, but unwilling to share power with them. Student opposition and continuing strikes by workers led the PMAC to declare a state of emergency in Addis Ababa and suspend all civil rights. These events caused ideological confusion and organizational restructuring in both the army and among the students. The student movement found itself divided on how to confront the military government. The leading element was the Marxist-Leninist-oriented Ethiopian People's Revolutionary Party, EPRP, which demanded a quick end to military rule and the formation of a people's government. Sharing a similar philosophy but different tactics was the smaller All Ethiopia Socialist Movement, MEISON, which also saw itself as Marxist-Leninist but attempted to work with the Derg to gain the support of progressive elements among the army. These two movements were also united in giving primacy to class over nation in the evolving debate. A myriad of other groupings from the student movement took varying positions on this issue, but the Oromo Liberation Front OLF, TPLF, and Ogadenis distinguished themselves by emphasizing national determination in their programs. The monarchy, the Orthodox Church, the land tenure system, together with the myths, values, and symbols of Abyssinia, were all part of the inheritance of the imperial regime and provided the legitimacy for its rule. In trying to confront this past, the military had to acquire a new basis of legitimacy as well as institutional structures through which it could govern. Socialism was to provide the ideological underpinnings of the state, and this was most forcefully expressed through the Land Proclamation of 4th March 1975, which nationalized land and brought about the dissolution of the centuries-old rural power structure. The Agrarian Transformation, however, had as much to do with the regime's survival than any commitment to scientific socialism. Nonetheless, these measures had the effect of undermining the radical agenda and outdated economic content of the government's major opposition, the EPRP. As part of its efforts to carry out its program in the countryside, as well as rid itself of student critics in the towns, the Derg organized the Zamacha, or campaign, that sent some 30 to 50,000 university and secondary students to the rural areas. To institutionalize its rule as well as to decentralize authority, the Derg created peasant associations in the rural areas and kebeles, or urban associations, in the town's infrastructure, which was essential in implementing local-level development projects. However, by 1977, the role of the peasant associations and kebeles had largely been reduced to that of mobilizing support for the Derg. The land reform had the effect of not only undermining the largely student-based opposition's demands for addressing the economic problems of the people, but also the economic elements of the national question, particularly in the South. As a result, it drove a wedge in the student movement between those who opted to support the military and those who had to refocus their opposition based on the demand for democracy. This question increasingly came to the fore, and tensions between the government and its radical urban critics became violent as the EPRP started a White Terror campaign in 1976 against the government, which in turn responded with its far more lethal Red Terror campaign. Initiated in Addis Ababa through the kebeles, the government spread the urban terror throughout the country. After the EPRP was largely exterminated in the towns, the Derg then turned on its ally, MEISON, which it eliminated by the end of 1977. By early 1978, the Derg's position was secure, and much of the country's intelligentsia were either dead, imprisoned, exiled, or engaged in rural insurrections. Taking advantage of Ethiopia's disorder, Somalia invaded the long-contested and Somali-inhabited Ogaden region, and this set the stage for the Soviets and the Cubans to end their alliance with Somalia and come to the defense of Ethiopia. The Derg's leftward turn led the United States to break with its long-term ally. Meanwhile, disarray within the Ethiopian state served to embolden the Eritrean liberation movements, which by 1977 were in control of most of the province and appeared close to overrunning Asmara and Ethiopia's main port of Massawa. However, the defeat of Somalia in the summer of 1977 freed up Soviet equipment and supplies, and with a vastly expanded army, the Derg was able to end the sieges of Eritrea's towns and force the dominant liberation movement, the EPLF, back to its base area at Nafka in the isolated Sahel region of northern Eritrea. While the Derg repeatedly acknowledged the past oppression of Ethiopia's subject peoples, including Eritreans, and asserted its intention to overcome this discrimination, it followed its Soviet benefactors' interpretation of the rights of subject peoples. This included the view that first these peoples constituted nationalities which only had the right to limited regional autonomy, and not nations which, at least in theory, had the right to secede, and secondly, ethnic tensions were only a reflection of class contradictions which were being overcome by Derg policies such as land reform. But the large numbers of Highland Christian youth that joined the EPLF in the late 1970s and the almost unnoticed founding of the TPLF in 1975 testify to the failure of the Derg's attempt to achieve an ethnic reconciliation in the Ethiopian state. Under Soviet and Eastern European influence, the Derg established the Commission to Organize the Party of the Working People of Ethiopia, COPWE, in 1979, but it was to be 5 more years before the Workers' Party of Ethiopia, WPE, was formed. These changes, however, largely left the Derg intact. Of 198 Central Committee members of the WPE, 116 were military officers, and only 25 members represented trade unions, peasant associations, women's associations, and youth organizations. Mengistu's position as General Secretary and Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces gave him total dominance despite official adherence to the notion of collective leadership. The establishment of the People's Democratic Republic of Ethiopia, PDRE, in 1987, quote, completed the formal creation of a new set of Marxist-Leninist institutions, end quote, but it represented a ceremonial rather than a real transfer of power from the military. Moreover, although modeled after the Soviet Union, the state was defined as unitary rather than federal, and no formal right of secession was granted. The end result of the process, as Harbison has put it, was the equation of the regime with the new Ethiopian state, for which it was once to be but the midwife. End of chapter 2.